You want my name? Which one? I'm known by many names. Dead Crow, Jackdaw Cook, Split-tongued Muse, Dark Rook in a bleak ray. What's in a name? Only millennia of lives lived. I've been here so long, I'm starting to look human. Time has filed down my voice with a rasp. Emperor of the crossroads, I nest over the forked path. You think I care about spells, incantations, alchemy? These are just artifacts of what I already know. My only interest in bones is to pick them clean. Blood-cloaked loner on a trail of finger bones. That's me. Black as the womb before starseeds snap life into being. Black as the feathers that fly straight from the eye of God. Stare into my left eye, I dare you. See what happens. Reality here moves like mercury, not iron. In my realm, stones on the beach are black embers, barely cooled. Leaves rave and sheeny in red moonlight. That sound you hear is not wind, but souls drifting past. Wind, a deft pianist, and every leaf another key. I've given up flying because thought is faster. If I only need to go a short distance, hell, the walk will do me good. In my realm, thought translates directly into reality. Karma stops lying on its ass in front of the TV all day. Equal forces are met with equal and instant reactions. You think you hate your enemy and want him dead, and gone! He's dead. You wonder one afternoon why grass isn't orange instead of green. And before your eyes, the entire landscape turns Mandarin Impressionist. You think something hurtful about the one you love, and she cries. Suddenly loving becomes much, much simpler. Then again, maybe not. Once I was white as the Arctic Circle, pristine as sunlight on a wall. Once my world was green and full of flowers just like this one. Meadows alive with birdsong. Streams flowing mountain crystal. Then one day, Skunk came by and said to me, "Be careful, Crow. Be proud of your thought magic and all the wonderful things it can do. But be careful." It was then I began to realize I was a god. But every day, Skunk came by and warned me, "Be careful." At first, I just laughed her off. But gradually, my patience flaked away like mica, and one day, when Skunk came into my sight, I exploded, a total eclipse of rage. I envisioned my world engulfed in flames, and it was so. Every living thing charred black. Now I was Dead Crow, King of Shadows. Dawnbringers and world seeders that they are, the Makers sensed a great threat. With power like that, I could black out an entire galaxy. In the past, only the coiling, bottomless throats of black holes could do that. Something would have to be done. But I'm nobody's fool. Simple frontal attack would never work on me. Trickery would have to be employed. So, the Makers invited me to a banquet as their guest of honor. A tribute to your genius, they said. Damn my vanity. Was a beautiful sight. Feathers white hot. A prime specimen of White Crow clan. Goddesses purred over me, stroking my plumage into light. Gods praised me for my mental powers to turn an entire world black like that. Singers sang me songs. Poets composed epic verses to Dead Crow's great deed. I confess, I let myself get a little sloppy with the wine, dancing on the table, answering song with song, poem with poem, joke with joke. Did they butter me up? Next thing I knew, the Makers set a mirror upon the table with liquid surface still as a pond. "What will I see?" I asked. "The truth of yourself," the Makers said. But, oh gods, what I saw! My beautiful white feathers turned black. Black as coal in the belly of rock. Black as the world my thought had consumed. Desperately, I turned to stare into a silver platter, hoping it wasn't so. But no, I was black. 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 "What have you done to me?" I screamed. "We've only shown you the truth of yourself, the Makers said. But I was only using the powers you gave me. How was I to know how dangerous it could be? But the party was over, and they were in no mood for discussion. Instead, they said they had a job for me. Had me step up to the mirror again. Sober now, my every step quivered. A weird incantation was uttered, and I felt myself being pulled into the mirror in a scurry of atoms, wondering if I was being torn apart. But there was no pain. My vision finally cleared. I found myself on a completely unfamiliar world. Gradually, I realized this is the place they call Earth. But why? Why take me away from my home? I begged. To my shock, my lovely singing voice, the pride of White Crow Clan, rasped horribly. I tried once or twice more to sing, but it was no use. No use. I'm not ashamed to say I wept. I wept. Lifting on an updraft, I slid over the forests and fields. Time weighed like the sun on my wings. I felt a sickening sense of millennia washing over me and over me. I didn't know how long I could take it. Decided to smash myself against the highest crag I could find. Just get it over with. But then there was that voice again. The Makers. You must not die, Crow. You are our watcher, and this is now your home. But for how long? How long? Too late. Too late. You can imagine the calm down from Magi of creation, sovereign of shades, alchemist of secrets, to a lowly carrion eater. From 1,000 languages to a hinge's rusty growl. And in this galactic backwater, worst of all, a scavenger kicked around by humans who shit their own nests. Prisoner and jailer in one. Freedom, a distant, torturing dream. I've been around a few millennia. I'd like to think I've learned a thing or two in 40,000 years. You want me to start coughing up the secrets? Fine. The Book of Secrets is bound in crow feathers. You want all the arcane equations, hyperspace, wormholes, time travel? Listen! I've seen the universe spread in every direction like strings of pearls. Every pearl, another world, another dimension skating sideways across time. Past, present, and future. Nothing but thought. And every thought, another world budding on the world tree. My time is over. Yours is just beginning. You want evolution? Give me someone who can think before they act. Give me poets who translate straight from Earth's core. Her signs and wonders are not in vain. Her secrets are ours. You think this world is everything there is? We see the stars from the bottom of a well. This reality, this world order we signed on to, we can agree it has failed. Make up a new one. Then again, I could be lying. Why not find out for yourself? I have a little confession to make. They say confession is good for the soul. But you're not gonna like this one very much. Once I murdered an entire village with nothing but my tongue. Could have done it with nothing but a thought tsunami. But language was new to me still, and after all, I am a curious bird. Translation obviously wasn't an issue. My wit, a caustic osmosis, soaking the moss beneath their feet. Couldn't stop till the ruin of bodies was complete. For an entire decade afterward, I said nothing. Not even the dry hinge of a croak in my throat. Genocide is no way to learn compassion. Slaughter, a poor substitute for the realization words have power. Use them at your peril. Jagged outlines, ghosting a block of obsidian.
Well, my name's Tom Wayman, and I'm here today with Art Joyce, the author of Dead Crow and the Spirit Engine, which we're gonna be talking about. And before we start, I just want to say what a fabulous job I think you did with this. I just really like the layout, and I'll explain why in a minute. But especially how throughout the book there's everything's woven together, so that there's pictures that repeat, there's phrases that repeat, and I found that particularly effective because you're talking about a whole lot of really big ideas, and there's something about having the repetition woven through that's very calming and unifying, because there's lots of ideas being thrown out, and one way in particular, besides just the repetition of image and certain phrases that I really liked, was how each poem after the title, there's a phrase, and the phrase might be from the poem before, it might be from the poem that's about to follow, or it might be from the next poem. But it also serves as a weave. So it's just an extra special thing, separate from content, which we're going to get into in a minute.
Yes.
But that pulls the whole book together in a way that makes it really a delight to read, and like I say, it tightens it together. I'm just going to give a summary of what goes on in it before we get to questions I have for you about it. You won't agree with my summary, because anytime you do a capsule summary, it's less than the whole thing. It's like the famous elevator speech where you only have 2 seconds. But essentially, in the book, in terms of plot, like an awful lot more is going on. Dead Crow, who's a member of the White Crow clan, because of his sort of hubris, he considers himself a god. He has this incredible thought magic. He's banished to Earth by the Makers, and the Makers are kind of the people that, or gods, or whatever they are, that it might even just be energy that gets the universe going. But Dead Crow, before he's exiled to Earth, he's transformed from white to black, and his beautiful singing voice is transformed to a croak. Then in his exile, which encompasses millennia, Dawn Crow appears, who's sort of, and we can talk about this, actually, we will talk about this, but she's like the feminine principle that enters the book. And Dead Crow also encounters Grandfather Raven at the controls of the Spirit Engine, which we'll come back to. And at the end of the story or plot, the Makers offer to revoke Dead Crow's exile, but he decides to stay on Earth with Dawn Crow. Yeah. So that's just so that when we're talking about these characters, people have something to hang it on. I know you do it differently in terms of summary. But
no, that's great.
Okay.
That's great.
So I'm going to first run through, talk about the characters, then I'm going to talk about the Spirit Engine, and then I've got a final big question. So when we first meet Dead Crow, before Dawn Crow appears, he's described as a loner, a watcher, a changeling with a bad attitude. But he calls himself the quintessence of loneliness. And that's my first question to you. One of the things that was so surprising about the book was that issue of loneliness. And so I really want to ask you about that theme in it. Just to give you some other examples, when Dawn Crow at one point speculates that she says the great mind, that is whatever sort of started the universe, to avoid being crushed by loneliness, invented the White Crow group. And she says that loneliness is the X factor in the universe. It's not dark matter, it's loneliness. This all surprised me. It wasn't what I expected. So maybe you can talk a bit about why loneliness and how that affects these characters.
Yeah, I think the reason that I did that was because of the fact that I wanted to have a character who was indeed a loner, an exile, somebody who had been cast out of his realm for a sin of hubris, and therefore found himself in this nearly untenable situation of being the only one of his kind on this new planet, or at least new to him, planet Earth, where his kind, not talking, standard genus crow, but this obviously this special clan that comes from another sector of the galaxy. He is literally the only one of his kind, which is partly why when Dawn Crow finally shows up, whether that's because the Makers decide to send her to him or she comes on her own volition, we don't really know, I don't explain that suddenly it is such a massive event in his life, because he has been for thousands of years literally alone, other than obviously all of the earthly creatures that he's observing and recording. So I felt that was really important to keep that thread consistent throughout. The idea of loneliness as the X factor in the universe rather than dark matter just sort of appealed to me because it took things beyond the level of sort of pure physics also into metaphysics, you might say.
So. Or emotion. That's what I felt was so great about it, was that because there is the talk about, these things are almost abstractions, but then suddenly you get an emotion as tying the book together. So it seemed like a strong idea, and I like to be surprised when I read. So that was one thing.
Great.
my second question about Dead Crow was that he presents himself as not very likable. Like at first he explains everything about himself, and then he says, I could be lying. He at one point he confesses that he murders an entire village. he doesn't think much of democracy or social evolution in another poem.
Yeah.
He describes himself in a couple of poems as kind of a loser in love. And so my question was, what's the advantage in terms of the story of setting up a narrator or storyteller or a central character who's not particularly reliable and not particularly admirable?
Yeah, I think there I'm drawing on the tradition and literature of the anti-hero. We see this hero cropping up, from time to time, possibly, as early as Dostoevsky with his character in Crime and Punishment, Raskolnikov, and then in the fantasy series, White Gold Wielder by Stephen R. Donaldson. I remember that making quite an impression on me as a young reader because of the fact that the central character there is really unlikable. I mean, he almost goes to pains to make him unlikable early in the story. And yet, somehow, you're compelled to read on. So I was really sort of enamored of the writerly challenge of being able to create an anti-hero that is dislikable, and yet somehow you feel like you do want to know more about him. You do want to find out what happens to this guy. In some respects, perhaps how he transcends his unlikableness or his anti-hero-ness, if you will. And also he's working his way through his own sort of neuroses, you might say, right? And his own initial sense of woundedness and reactiveness, the fact that he so easily loses his temper, in fact, led to his initial exile. And then it happens again once he's here, because of course you don't immediately transform, right? It takes time and years and reflection and learning and so on before you kind of start to mellow and sort of sand off the rough edges.
Well, one of the ways he became sort of especially interesting to me is when Dawn Crow shows up. Like she shows up in the 13th poem of 30, so right around the middle. But my question is about her role, because my sense is that she kind of undercuts his view of himself, his exile. Like one of the first things she says to him is, "That's quite a chip on your shoulder," and yeah. I'm thinking, "Whoa!" She contradicts some of his attitudes. Like at one point, she says to him, "Have you also gone blind from coming here?" And she's talking about how Earth has actually a fair bit to recommend it, because he was putting it down. So, yeah, my question is, because she is pretty central once she shows up, she's never lost from the rest of the story. So how, what role did you see her in all this?
Well, definitely there is an element of the yin-yang happening there, very much from that Eastern tradition where you have the male-female or the dark and the light, and each one always has at the center of it a little drop of the other, right? And so I also felt I needed to have a sort of counterbalancing voice in this piece. For one thing, of course, as a writer, it's very difficult to sustain a monologue for that length of time. Pretty soon audiences are, even with the best monologue, going to start to get bored or wish somebody else was talking, frankly. So there was that sort of dramatic challenge that presented itself to me. And I realized, somewhat late in the writing of the poems, I mean, this has been in process now since 2009, when the first poems were written. And I had already written about, I don't know, maybe 10 or 12 poems or something by that point, and had kind of just begun to realize this is getting to be a long monologue. So both from that perspective and also in terms of, the dramatic arc of the story, it became apparent to me that this feminine character needed to be there to counterbalance him and hopefully as you say, help them reflect on the fact that, well, maybe you aren't quite as evil as you think you are, or as much of a negative force as you're portraying yourself to be.
She's a really strong character, though. I mean, she doesn't cut him much slack in there, and so that kind of, I mean, you're right about it. Just brings a whole other mindset into the, or at least that was my impression, into the poem. Which again, it cranks up the tension. Because I wasn't sure where you were going to go with that. Because she really disagrees with a lot of what he says. I mean, there's affection there, but and one of the things she says to him, and this is where we're moving to it. She says, if you need a roadmap, because he's dial up the ancestors. So the ancestor in the poem that gets dialed up is Grandfather Raven, and he shows up running the spirit engine, and the question I have was about that issue of what the spirit engine is, and how is it connected to the concept of the ancestors that will provide a roadmap, because it's obviously important. It's Dead Crow and the spirit engine. Yes. So it's a kind of central thing. One thought I had was that the machine is time itself, because there's a quote in poem 24 which says that in the spirit engine is where quasars, just like oysters, species appear and then disappear. So it seemed to be something about either the unfolding of the universe or time itself. But maybe you can talk a little bit about what you saw the spirit engine doing, but also just physically, because it seems to be, it's a machine with levers and dials and so on.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think at any point I ever really nailed that down decisively. It was one of those sort of things that comes to you in an epiphany late at night. Some of the best ones come, right. And but I think it's, as you say, all of the above and more. So it's time, it's relativity, it's the creation and destruction that goes on all the time in the universe, as we know, right? Things are constantly in flux. You've got the black hole collapsing in on itself, and then that gathers energy enough to eventually birth a new solar system or a new galaxy, whatever. So I kind of wanted a sense of that, and also this idea of souls. We, as human beings, we have this burning need to know what happens after we die. Where do we go? What's the mechanism for reincarnation, if there is one, right? I'm not saying that there is. I don't want to say definitively that there is, but it was an interesting idea to sort of combine those elements of time and relativity and space, and what happens to the soul. In fact, are we simply a little packet of finite energy, like so many other things in the universe, that is continually recycled as a soul, or are we not? It could be, as I said, all of the above or none of those things.
But it's the ancestor, Grandfather Raven, that's sort of controlling that. So I was interested in that, because that does suggest the idea of the present somehow comes out of the past, and those kinds of connections. Was that kind of part of it anyway?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I have a strong sense of the ancestors in my own life that's grown over time. I mean, when I was younger, I really did not feel that way. I had a much more sort of concretist, materialist conception about life and death, and when you're dead, and that's it. But over time, through my own experiences of losing people that I loved and so on, and getting a sense almost of guidance from them, that I think has really been lost in our culture, again, with this ultra materialistic
sort of view that is as being presented to us as the mainstream perspective. The historian Yuval Noah Harari, the author of Homo Sapiens, for example, has conclusively stated that, well, the life sciences cannot verify the presence of a soul, therefore it does not exist. There is no empirical evidence to suggest that a soul exists. Well, okay, sure, but again, that's only seeing things through a very narrow materialist lens, and we don't know. That's the fact of the matter. Philosophers, religious leaders, and so on have debated this question for millennia. So it's arrogant, I think, for anybody to come out and make a statement like that. And so I really thought it was very important to get readers sort of tapped into this idea that there is something, some kind of a realm there that is beyond the one we know, and yet seems to have some kind of an impact on us. I had a Siksika Blackfeet counselor once who told me that in his culture's perspective, they view the dead and the living realms as essentially walking side by side, almost in the aspect of quantum physics, or this idea of parallel universes, and that every so often, when there's a need, the ancestors will reach across the veil and tap somebody on the shoulder, so to speak, and offer guidance or help and so on. So I think that's where a lot of that idea for Grandfather Raven came from.
Okay, and so that uncertainty about all this, is that why? Because one of the things that makes the grandfather interesting is he won't give any advice. He won't tell. He doesn't explain anything. He just says it's complicated. Yeah. And so that made him kind of an interesting character in his own right. Like, especially after Dead Crow and Dawn Crow, are very articulate about what they believe, even if they don't always agree. Yes. But then you've got Grandfather Raven, who just refuses more or less to answer any questions, so leaves that big uncertainty. Yeah. Is that comes out of that idea that we don't know these things?
Yes. Yeah, exactly. I mean, again, I didn't want to, sort of present this in an empirical way, like I had some kind of answer that nobody else did, right? Because it's all speculative. I mean, I can't honestly claim to have studied philosophy other than a glancing view of it. But, for me, I always found that it was so highly speculative that, basically anyone could say anything if they argued it plausibly enough. Yeah. And someone would believe it and accept it and live their lives by it. So for me, I think I actually find greater sense of, perhaps if you want to call it rootedness, in the uncertainty principle, this idea that we don't know, and that doesn't have to be threatening, that we don't know, that in fact there is some strength to be gained from ambiguity, in that it doesn't nail things down. It does allow for a certain amount of mystery to be alive in our lives. And I think if you look at any of the mythological or mystical traditions, mystery is definitely an important element.
And so that's why it's part of the title, is that it reflects back on what Dead Crow and Dawn Crow are saying. Yeah, that it's because when I first read it, I wasn't clear why the Spirit Engine got sort of top billing, but that makes sense to me, that because what they're arguing about, at least it seems to me, there, you don't have one win and the other not win. Yeah. It's just presented in much the same way. But before we leave Grandfather Raven, I have to ask, because we see him at the Spirit Engine, I think, in a couple of poems, but then suddenly he's in the retirement home, and Dead Crow goes to visit him, and although he's very articulate in the retirement, he's still not coming across with any answers. Yeah. So I was wondering where the retirement home, fitted in, or is it just part of that sort of life cycle stuff that everyone kind of faces.
Yeah, I mean, again, it's a bit ambiguous. One of the things that I wanted to have with this whole sequence is the freedom to move in an elliptical rather than in a linear fashion. So that means I gave myself the freedom as a writer, as a poet, to leave a few loose ends that aren't tied up. And in that case, perhaps also to signal that no being that we know of or no entity that we know of is truly immortal, right? Hence the idea that Dead Crow himself is not a god per se, but a demigod, right? In other words, his lifespan itself is ambiguous. We know that it goes on for thousands of years, but we don't know how long, right? And likewise with Grandfather Raven, there's almost perhaps a suggestion there that maybe this is sort of an office that successive individuals fulfill,
Yes. Yeah.
right, down through eons of time. And for all we know, his tenure might be 10,000 years and then he's gone into the retirement home, or it might be 100,000, or, might be 10, we don't know.
Well, for sure, when I started reading that, I thought he was going to sort of pass the torch to Dead Crow and say, now you got to run the Spirit Engine. But instead of that ambiguity that you talk about just rolls on, and so I liked that. I thought that keeps it interesting. The big question I want to ask both refers to the beginning and the ending of the book. So at the start, it talks about myth or newly refurbished tales, and it says that they can provide not only transcendence beyond the world, but grounding within the world. So I wanted to get you to talk about how does Dead Crow, the story or myth or newly refurbished tale, how do you see it providing grounding for its readers? Especially because Dawn Crow, who's oppositional to lots of stuff, she has this thing: when did advice ever help anyone? Yeah. So if the book is written in part to provide grounding, to provide help or advice, and yet that voice says, well, when did that ever help anybody? Now I understand that it can have a contradiction. There's nothing wrong with literature that has a contradiction, but I was just curious about how you saw the book sort of helping people to understand, their lives or our lives. Or
Yeah, really good question. I think for me, when it comes to mythology, one of the things that I find is that often at the basis of our religious traditions, let's face it, is a set of myths or a series of myths. And what seems to happen over time is that these myths get taken increasingly literally to the point where they become doctrine. And I don't really think that the original prophets or seers or whatever you want to call them, poets, really intended that to happen. I think that they meant for that to be something that was illustrative of human existence, not denotative of it, right? Because each individual's process of discovery is unique. So, to me, it's a bit odd to kind of say, well, if you just do this or just believe this, then, everything's going to work out, right? Because as we know, that isn't necessarily how life works. So,
I wish.
Yeah. So there's that. When I say that it provides grounding in the world too, I think, we often hear about how religious tradition in particular has a transcendent quality to it, that it's somehow supposed to take us out of ourselves. And in some respects, I feel that's kind of been overdone. Like there's been a little bit too much emphasis on, this transcendent of getting beyond the body. And there's echoes obviously in there of the Christian tradition of, the sinfulness of the body and the need to elevate oneself above it, literally, if you think you're going to heaven, for example, right? Whereas, I think a good understanding of myth as metaphor, as allegory, as illustration, um, in a way kind of grounds us a bit more, right? Because we're not treating this as a literal story, but as something that can provide us with some sustenance or some insight or, perhaps in some way a form of spiritual transcendence. But nevertheless, we're not kind of going off into space thinking, well, yeah, this is all literally true.
But when it comes to Dead Crow, the story, as we get it, the argument or contradictions between Dead Crow's view and Don Crow's view, it it I guess the question is sort of what do you want the reader to take away? I mean, that's a simplification, but because, I mean, for me, a lot of the pleasure of the book was the fact that this argument is not ever concluded. Like we're just left with all, these different points of view, and then when you turn to the ancestor for the final word, he doesn't come across either. And yet, there's this spirit engine that's the universe grinds on. That we're part of that. So I don't know if this is your intent, but that's kind of which I thought in a strange way was reassuring, that you can believe something really strongly, but you're aware that other people believe something else really strongly, but in both cases, time goes on and the universe continues to unfold, as it were. So there was something sort of reassuring about that, but I didn't know if that was the way. Even if there's no ultimate source to say this is right, like Grandfather Raven doesn't become the guy in the sky with a big white beard that's going to tell you, this is right and this is wrong. He just refuses to explain, which sort of throws it back, presumably, on the reader.
Yeah, I think that you're on the right track with that. I mean, because it's poetry, right, and mythology at the same time. I really did not want to sort of hand the reader a kind of a nice little package that says, okay, this is what it means at the end. If you want that, maybe what you need to do is just read a novel where all the, plot points are all tied up nice and neatly. So, yeah, I think I wanted a level of ambiguity there that would allow readers to reflect themselves on these ideas and, ultimately come to their own conclusions, rather than present them with something.
Yeah, one of the things that hasn't come out of our discussion was how much kind of lore is worked into the book, that when Dead Crow speaks or Don Crow speaks, there's a reference to all kinds of things from human history and from human mythology and the history of mythology and so on. Yes. That's quite specific, and there's a glossary in the back, that explains some of that. And like we've been, as an interviews go, we've been in much more general kinds of terms, but in fact. Dead Crow speaks out of a lot of knowledge, and Don Crow too, to a certain extent, which just makes it more specific.
Yeah, and I really wanted to do that. I wanted to ground it in a good, solid overview of history and mythology. And, for my own family tradition, I've got a lot of Irish and English in my family tradition, and so there's that there, as well as other traditions. In fact, I wanted to draw on the entire world corpus of mythology dealing with that characteristic figure of crow or raven, which appears in almost every culture in the world in different guises. So for example, you've got in Europe, typically, it's a harbinger of death. It's a dark omen. Or if you go to the Irish Morrigan figure, who's a goddess, she has the power to shapeshift from crow into human. When she appears in her crow form, typically she does appear on a battlefield to an individual soldier, and they know that means they're going to die in that battle. But she also has this whole other life where, as a human woman of some beauty, she goes after one of the famous Irish heroes as a lover. And so then you come over to Canada and you get to the West Coast Haida and other First Nation stories of Raven, and you have stories like, how the Raven stole the light, or how the Raven did this or did that, and it tends to be almost the opposite of the European mythos, where it's more of a creator or a trickster figure rather than a harbinger of death, right? So what I found really fascinating about that is that gives you, again, it's like this yin-yang totality of this mythical figure, where it encompasses everything, that is out there.
But I have to say that although all that lore is in the book, that you make these characters fresh. They're not encumbered by all the resonances. So yeah. They're their own character. And again, that was good, because I imagine there's a temptation to load it up. But I thought you resisted that temptation beautifully in the sense that these characters, really are themselves. They have those resonances, but they're not weighted down by it. So it makes the book very fresh to read.
I'm relieved to hear that.
No, well, that's what I found anyway. That it didn't seem. They seemed their own person, if you like, if you can say that about a crow. They didn't seem to be dragging into the book. Mm. Well, before we stop, I just want to ask too, like, is there an important part of the book that we haven't talked about in terms of intention and delivery of that intention that you wish that we had spoken about?
I could mention a couple of things. Interestingly, there is a poem in there called Pandemic, which was written in 2009, one of the first poems, in response to whatever it was, swine flu or whatever at the time was being promoted as the so-called pandemic. But, when you start reading about pandemics and the history of them, you start to realize that like myths themselves, they often carry these very similar kinds of themes throughout, right? So, whether it's the Black Death of the 14th century or the 1665 plague or whatever, human beings are still human beings. Yeah. So they react the same way or some very similar ways, regardless of the level of technology that they're at, which to me is far more interesting, the way that people react to things. And so he, Crow is kind of, because he is a watcher figure, he's kind of an overseer, looking at this historical passage of events in the case of pandemics, for example, and seeing a lot of similarities.
And since he acts like a pandemic himself from time to time, that's where I thought it was like a parallel thing. It's like, okay, you think I'm bad, but nature itself does these kinds of scorched earth events from time to time. Yeah. So it seemed a strong parallel, and we we don't think of nature as evil. It's just nature, and it's indifferent rather than evil, and so I felt it added another dimension to the dead crow figure in kind of, without making too much of it. It points to the fact that nature herself can wield a thought magic, as it were, that can be pretty devastating too.
Absolutely, yeah. The other one that I should mention, because it does concern a major theme in the book that underpins it, is the Tír na nÓg poem. Tír na nÓg is the Irish story of this mythical land of the fairies, as it were, the Danan people, who who never die, never age, never get sick, right? It's this sort of paradise of pleasure that just goes on. And you have, this character Angus who ends up, going there with one of the fairy women and then coming back after 300 years to see his country, of course, totally changed. All of his loved ones and people all gone. And the minute that he sets foot on the soil of Ireland again for the first time in 300 years, all the deadly force of those 300 years comes crashing in on him, and his youth vanishes instantly, and he becomes a 300-year-old dying man. And I saw that as a wonderful metaphor, allegory for civilizations themselves. That, they have this life cycle, and they often are founded upon these, literally foundational myths, right? Whether it's ancient Rome or any other civilization. And so it seems that we are almost fated as human beings in a way to play out these myths. Once we set them up and we set them in motion, it's like we almost have no choice in a way but to play them out to their logical or illogical end, as the case may be. And, if you look at America as a prime example, Canada similarly, but perhaps less so, this secessioning from the mother empire, the Revolutionary War, where they made that firm break with the old country, and they created their own new constitution, and regardless of whatever inherent hypocrisy might have been there because so many of the fathers of the Constitution were slave owners, nevertheless there was a very high degree of idealism that went into the formation of that Constitution for this brand new country, as if to say, we are going to create our Shangri-La on earth. We are going to create our Tir na Nog on earth, and nothing is going to get in the way of it. It's going to be fantastic, right? It's going to be great. It's going to be better than any other civilization that came before, and it's never going to die, right? Again, so you get this idea of immortality in there. And so I just thought that, where we are in the space of time right now as a civilization, at least in the West, in my view anyways, and this comes from a fairly broad reading of history, I think we are in one of those terminal phases where whatever it is that's going to come next, certainly what has come before is really at its very kind of end stages. And it's like Angus coming back from Tir na Nog and setting foot on the soil of Ireland for the first time in 300 years and realizing in that moment he's going to die.
Well, certainly in the poems, that concept of empire, and there's been so many, and they rise, they fall, yes. And that kind of parallel with an individual life, where you're born, you're young, you race out, to do all this great stuff in the world, and then whether you like it or not, eventually, your age catches up with you, and again, that's why I thought Grandfather Raven in the retirement home was so great. Like at one moment, he's running the universe, he's at the controls of the spirit engine, but not, as you pointed out, could be 10,000 years, but then eventually, he's in reduced circumstances, in the same way that those empires that are referred to throughout. So that it's one more, like when I started this, I talked about how there's so much repetition, and it forms a kind of weavery through the book that ties it together in a way that you're constantly going, aha, that's, this ties to that, and that ties to this. So it makes the whole thing seem like a complete job, which for this reader anyway, is a tremendous pleasure to see it tied together in that way, not tied together in the sense of providing answers, but tied together as an artifact, yes. with all its questions and ambiguities intact, but the artifact itself there's something satisfying about that repetition. I have a friend in California who says repetition is the soul of poetry, and I don't know if I agree with that, but in this case, it really works extremely well.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I mean, I definitely had the idea of, almost of music too, in a way of, the reprise, or the chorus that is repeated, and I love the way in popular music that is used to, bring you back to the beginning or bring you full circle.
Yeah, we should say the final poem in the book is called Reprise.
Yes.
And it's like a duet where Dead Crow and Dawn Crow speak, and they bring in all kinds of phrases and ideas that have been explored in individual poems. And again, it helps tie things together, without giving you an answer. But it feels complete. It gives a feeling of completeness, I guess, is what I'm struggling to say.
Yeah.
That's I think works really well.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, it needed to be there, I think, because it's a kind of as you say, it is a reprise or a coda, and you can hear a lot of repetition of phrases from earlier verses in that section, as well as new parts of it, so that it's a synthesis really of, the reprise of earlier parts and themes, as well as, trying to synthesize what it is that Dead Crow and Dawn Crow have sort of hashed out between themselves over the time they've been together, because there is a great deal of affection between them. You can see that almost in the very beginning, the first poem where they meet, that there's an almost instant attraction, and there's a magnetic pull between the two of them that makes them want to overcome whatever friction seems to be inherent in the relationship, right? And so that they both grow as a result of that, right?
Yeah, well, that's the male female endless struggle, and how a relationship has to be built. But yeah, there's some wonderful lines where Dead Crow at the first says, I gave her my best tail flick," which I thought was so great, because that's what crows actually do, and it's a great line.
Oh, thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much, and I guess I'll just
Thank you.
say to people that if what we've been talking about today is intriguing, you should pick up a copy of the book, and I think you'll enjoy it.
Thank you very much, Tom.